Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And we're on part 3 of our story tonight, which is absolutely fascinating. We learn of a woman called Lilac who's in her 50s. She's living next door to a very aloof next door neighbour who all the town is asking questions about, because this woman appears to be very, very abrupt, very, very distant, keeping a very low profile, and doesn't obviously want any attention directed at her from the townsfolk. But Lilac overheard a conversation, and she's come to learn that this young lady is part of a witness protection program. It would seem that her own brother was killed very tragically by evil men in a drug cartel. So she got involved with this drug cartel, went out with one of the young men called Dirk Underwood, and having discovered that, she was able to witness against him in a court of law. And this meant from then forth, her life was in serious danger. So she came to this small town on her own back, hoping that she could begin a brand new life for herself. But now her boyfriend, who she got in touch with, has followed her to her new home, and she's terrified that her cover might be blown. So let's continue with our story.
But is that a bad thing, Petal? Let's just say, under your new identification, people will never suspect a thing. You can make up an entire fictitious story if you like. The trusting folk in this town will lightly believe every single word of it. You came to this town because you're estranged from your parents. You wanted to get as far away from them as you possibly could. You decided to begin again in this idyllic town. You're an author writing articles for a science magazine. That's why you remain at home all day long, tucked very nicely away in this cute little cottage of yours. You needed a secluded, idyllic place to work. There you go. I've already made up a story for you in a single second. That was all it took.
But I can't possibly say that, Ryan. I've already told our nosy next-door neighbour that I'm retired. And she was asking so many awkward questions.
Whoa! What did you say? You mean you told your next-door neighbour you're retired? Are you stark raving mad? You are the one telling me to be more discreet. But you're drawing attention to yourself, saying you're retired at such a young age. That's bound to get the tongues in town wagging. I mean, who retires in their 20s, for goodness sake?
Well, it's true in a way, isn't it? I mean, I don't actually need to work. I'm just worried about your coming here today, Ryan. It was a dreadful mistake. Are you absolutely 100% certain you weren't being followed? Look at me. Look at my hands. I'm literally shaking and trembling like a leaf. The thought of you being followed here terrifies me. If those wretched people get hold of me, they will not kill me kindly. I hope you realise that. It will be a slow, painful death, as I keep telling you, to maximise their revenge.
I'm sure I wasn't followed here, Petal. I'm not stupid. I was very prudent and careful. I would never willingly put the love of my life in danger.
But how can you be sure that you weren't followed?
I'm as sure as can be.
I want you to go, Ryan. I really do. You're putting both of us at risk coming here. If they knew for a moment I was even in the New York State area, they'd think it was Christmas. I told you. We cannot see each other until I feel absolutely certain I'm safe. I know it's hard, but it is what it is. We have to do this for our own safety.
For how long, Petal? This is doing my head in. I can't stand being away from you.
For as long as necessary, Ryan. I can't promise that we can ever resume where we left off. Sometimes it's better to draw a line in the sand and be done with it. They know you're involved in my life. That puts you in mortal danger. I was such a fool to give you my address, to send me that parcel. I mean, what if they came after you, tried to hurt you, demand you to tell them my location?
They would have to kill me first, Petal, before I told them anything. I would lay down my life for you, and you know that.
You've got to go, Ryan. Please don't talk like this. And for goodness sake, don't come back again if you know what's good for you.
You can't do that to me, Petal. I love you. Can we not at least talk about this? You're not going to invite me in for a drink or something, perhaps? I've been on the road for a long time. I'm parched. This goddamn heat wave is killing me.
I'm sorry, Ryan. I can't encourage you. I know you love me, but right now, I need to be on my own. I can't have a relationship with anyone. I barely get to sleep at night. I'm always looking over my shoulder. Have you any idea what it's like to live in abject fear every single day, wondering whether each day might be your last, which I hasten to say, Ryan, is a very real possibility. And we shouldn't be standing out here talking. Anybody could be listening, especially that nosy next-door neighbour of mine. She's always snooping around in the yard.
But you've had plastic surgery, Petal, and with your tan you're barely recognisable anymore. You used to be fair. It's been 5 years since the court case.
You know the saying, Ryan, an elephant never ever forgets. Dirk Underwood's memory would make an elephant look decidedly small, let me tell you. Besides, that wrathful man thought I loved him. I deceived him well. And to find out I made a fool out of him would certainly stir him up, let me tell you. And he wants revenge, you can be sure of that. In that perfectly inauspicious, inopportune moment, things so often go wrong, and Lilac's pruning shears slipped out of her fingers like butter because it was such a hot day. They fell to the ground with a mighty thud. She hurriedly crouched clandestinely behind the bush, cursing herself for her foolishness. Did you hear that? Oh my goodness, did you hear that, Ryan? I think somebody's been listening in to our conversation. You better hope that was my next-door neighbour. You better hope that was a nosy old bat, and not someone more consequential.
Don't be ridiculous. It was probably nothing.
It's not nothing. I'm telling you, someone was there. Someone was listening to us. Lilac could sense that her next-door neighbour was now pacing up and down anxiously, peering into her yard. She had hoped her neighbour would not see her cowering there in the bushes, eavesdropping on their conversation. I know I heard a noise. Do you think someone sneaked into my neighbour's property and is furtively listening behind some of her garden shrubs?
You're worrying about nothing, Petal. You're overreacting and being far too dramatic. You're living on tenterhooks, and I understand that. But I believe it's all in your head. You're just a bit jumpy, that's all.
And I wouldn't be jumpy if you hadn't come here today, Ryan. I should never have given you this address. I couldn't trust you, could I? I never expected you to come here to ruin everything. What on earth were you thinking?
I'm so sorry, Petal. You're right. I don't know what I was thinking. I should never have come.
Well, good. I'm glad you realise that, Ryan. You need to go. I'm really sorry to treat you so brusquely like this, but it is for the best. Lilac watched the young man walking to his car rather soberly. Petty called after him. I'm very sorry. It's very nice of you to ask, but as I told you, I've already recruited another garden service. The young man nodded, climbed into his car, lifted his hand in a half-hearted gesture of goodbye, and drove away, probably feeling pretty miserable. Lilac couldn't believe what had just unfolded and everything that she had heard. It would seem her next-door neighbour, Petty Waincroft, was not who she claimed to be. One of the Esther sisters had been right when she'd said maybe her new next-door neighbour was hiding something. It was clear to Lilac that Petty Waincroft was in some kind of very serious trouble, that had certainly required her to be part of a witness protection program that involved protecting herself and immediate members of her own family from some unscrupulous Machiavellian thugs that were part of a scandalously disreputable drug cartel. Ostensibly the venomous ringleader, a man by the name of Dirk Underwood, with a notoriously dangerous and ruthlessly formidable reputation, had indiscriminately murdered Petty Waincroft's brother in cold blood, by way of example, placing his head in a plastic bag to show other members of the cartel that if you mess with me, this is invariably what will happen to you as well. The horrifying imagery brought tears of disgusted revulsion to Lilacs' eyes. Petty had pretended to be this noxious mobster's girlfriend in order to find out everything about the drug cartel and their insidious dark secrets, who the movers and shakers invariably were. By the sounds of things, Petty Waincroft, if that was indeed her real name, which Lilac seriously doubted, was living under a different assumed identity, probably given to her by the authorities. She had testified against Dirk Underwood, the ringleader of this drug cartel, who by all accounts was after her to extract his revenge, especially since she had made a fool of him by pretending to be his girlfriend, so she could get as much evidence to use against him to incriminate him in a court of law. It would seem that Lilac's rather unassuming next-door neighbour was, in fact, a steely, very courageous, brave young woman who would stop at nothing to get back at the malignant man who had vindictively killed her brother. Indeed, she had placed herself in mortal danger, serious enough for her to get her identity completely changed and to opt for plastic surgery to radically alter her appearance. Who would go to those kind of extreme measures unless they really feared for their lives? Lilac suddenly felt a solicitous sympathy for her neighbour, and could now understand why the woman had been so buttoned up, rather remote and unforthcoming, always pushing away the friendliness of the townfolk. She privately thought that from thenceforth she would keep an astute, very careful eye on Petty Waincroft to ensure her neighbour's safety, in case the thugs who were after her, on behalf of their ringleader, who was now languishing in a prison, made an unwelcome appearance in their small town. Lilac knew she was privy to a secret that she could never share with a single solitary soul, for that might put her neighbour's life in serious jeopardy. She wondered why Petty had chosen to come to a small town like this. People were forever asking questions. There was no doubt that tongues were wagging, including Lilac's herself, all about the mysterious new stranger. So far from succeeding in disappearing into the shadows, as Petty Waincroft had obviously hoped she would, she had inadvertently drawn a great deal of unwanted attention to herself. It was almost certainly true that had she been living in a busy metropolis, she could so easily disappear into a large crowd, like one ant among millions. But out here, she stuck out like the quintessential sore thumb. So coming to this idyllic part of the world, to a small town like this, may not have been the most judicious decision of all. But it sounded like Petty Waincroft had a mind of her own, had stood up to her well-meaning advisers with a resolute determination to live a free life, which could potentially put her at a precarious risk. The next morning, when Lilac knew that Petty was taking her normal jog in the woodgrove, like she did early every morning, before the sun fully came out, Lilac decided that she would surreptitiously follow the young lady into the woods and go for a casual stroll herself. It would be good to step up her exercise regime, which was pretty non-existent. Increase her fitness, perhaps. Everybody said walking was the best exercise for your health, didn't they? There was no doubt in Lilac's mind that Buddy would almost certainly appreciate a good walk when the temperatures remained cool, which would not be for terribly long. Buddy had not been able to walk for quite a while, as he had sustained a rather mysterious limp to his right leg, but was fully recovered, and the vet had actively encouraged Lilac to take him for walks. There was no time like the present, she decided. Buddy's tail began to thump excitedly when Lilac put on his collar and lead, and moments later Lilac saw the willowy figure of Petty running past her cottage, jogging towards the cul-de-sac at the end of the road, which led up to the trail that opened out into a sprawling grove of trees that went on for ever and ever, it would seem. She knew she wanted to keep an eye on Petty, so Lilac astutely followed the young woman, with Buddy by her side. If she bumped into Petty in the woods, she would feign surprise and say something casual like,
Oh, fancy seeing you here, Petty. What a lovely surprise. I didn't know you came running into the woods. I often go here for a walk, you know. Some people could call her a snoop. If Lilac's daughter Bernice was still alive, and had not so inauspiciously died of sickle cell anemia all those years ago, she'd likely be round about Petty's age by now. So Lilac felt oddly protective towards the young lady, especially after unfortunately having eavesdropped in on a very disquieting conversation a day prior, a conversation that she should never have heard. This had left her feeling distinctly unsettled and very troubled about the safety of her next-door neighbour. She had a dreadful foreboding feeling in the pit of her gut that something quite awful might become of the young lady. As Lilac thought long and hard about her next-door neighbour, she felt like she'd become a character caught up in a mystery thriller and suspense novel, which in its own peculiar way was rather exciting, if not a little bit disorientating, as things like this did not usually happen in this unassuming, very demure town, where time went by at a leisurely pace and the community was relaxed and carefree. This was not the kind of hotspot on the map of New York State where you would expect something wildly dangerous to happen. But life can surprise you when you least expect it to, and little did Lilac know that things were going to get a whole lot more bizarre, so much so that in the years to come she'd be asking herself again and again, did that really happen? It was about 5 years after Lilac's daughter's passing that her husband Niles had also tragically passed away. It had been devastating for Lilac, but she believed he died from a broken heart, as losing their beloved daughter was too much for him. It had torn him up into shreds, and he'd never been the same man after that. Of course she didn't blame him for that. Parents were never expected to outlive their own children. Niles had simply lost the will to live any more, and like some of the scorched roses, on a very hot day, she had watched Niles wilt away, slowly fading away into obscurity from the world, like the bleached ink on a canvas, until he was no more, so that Lilac had lost the two most beloved people in her life. These days her golden retriever Buddy had become like a child to her. Sadly now he too was becoming old. As Lilac gingerly navigated her way down the sandy path of the cul-de-sac, there was a buoyant skip to her step. She swung her arms energetically backwards and forwards to energize her movements, passing a few familiar whitewashed cottages along the way that were all huddled closely together side by side, like old friends. Lilac knew everybody very well that lived in these cottages, but all was serenely quiet and undisturbed at this early hour of the morning, and the soft light dappled the cottages in a pretty glow. It was about 5 to 6. She finally reached the end of the cul-de-sac and sashayed up a slightly precarious steep hilly incline, littered by loose stones, patches of grass, and the occasional cluster of rambling wild flowers that mischievously poked their bright little heads through the stony soil. Buddy had his nose pinned to the ground, as if he'd picked up an intriguing scent that rather tickled his fancy, so his tail was wagging excitedly. Once they got to the top of the hilly slope, the ground cordially and rather graciously appeared to even itself out, becoming distinctly flatter and easier to walk. It stretched itself out widely, like an all-encompassing yawn, opening out into many different footpaths, too many to choose from if you were a novice or a stranger to the area, for this was a wood-grove that could happily invite you to get completely lost, for it was like a never-ending maze of trees. Lilac and Buddy followed the familiar long windy footpath that was thankfully very clearly marked, and seemed to beckon them through the tall lofty trees, inviting them to enter under the shaded canopy of this verdant oasis. It was here that Lilac let Buddy off the lead. Her dog went gratefully charging down the trail, heavily scattered with pine needles and the mulched leaves from the previous fall. The black soil she walked across was richly fertile under her boots. Buddy was probably on pursuit of a rabbit or something, which would be so typical of him, as being a retriever he loved to chase, and retrieved anything that dared to move. There were times her incorrigible retriever
had spontaneously dropped a dead animal at her feet, like a ball, almost as if Buddy expected Lilac to throw it for him, to chase, but Lilac stayed the hell away from any decaying dead bodies, especially when they became rancidly putrid, and Buddy had a penchant for picking out the smelliest things he could find in the grove. Sometimes it took days to get the smell of decomposition out of Buddy's soft golden coat, even after numerous washes, because that vile smell seemed to hang around like an unwelcome guest you could never get rid of. I really should exercise more often. This wood grove is magnificent, Lilac thought to herself. I've forgotten how good it is to come for a walk in the morning like this, she thought, enjoying the fresh feeling of the crisp, gentle breeze blowing against her cheeks. The air was injected with the rich smell of pine terpenes, and the pretty trill of the dawn chorus high up in the trees seemed to lift the whole ambience of the woods. The morning light prettily sprinkled itself through the branches of the trees, making the rich foliage adorning the branches look like a green overcoat of tassels that appeared to be glistening. The footpath was swathed in a gossamer golden light, and the foliage under all the trees appeared to be dappled in a silvery dew that clung to the leaves like glitter. Lilac trudged through the trees, beating the ground heavily with her boots, for she was not desperately light on her feet, so if anybody was around, they would likely hear her coming. She felt reasonably invigorated, refreshed, and really appreciative of the rich, lush foliage that swaddled her on every side. So much so she almost forgot the real reason she'd come here, which was to follow her neighbour. Her current enjoyment had seized her distraction. Her focus was otherwise engaged in this charming, prepossessing moment. Rabbits merrily bounded down the footpath, and a rambunctious, overzealous Buddy gave them all chase. His infectious enthusiasm made Lilac all but chuckle. Lilac observed squirrels darting up trees, looking down at her mischievously through dark, spirited but inquiring eyes, studying her rather curiously, as if her presence invited great interest. At one point Buddy stopped at a tree. He sat back on his haunches, looking up at a branch. He began to whine with an urgent eagerness. "What is it, Buddy?" asked Lilac. "There's nothing there, boy. Now let's carry on with our walk, shall we?" Buddy did not move. His eyes were steadfastly fixed on a tree branch. He continued to whine. Lilac then followed Buddy's obsessed gaze, and that was when she observed a couple of dead rabbits hanging by their floppy necks on a tree branch, with leather thongs tied around their necks that had been tied to the branch by a rather peculiar-looking leather thong of some kind. The rabbits looked suspiciously like they'd only been recently strangled. There were no signs of any gunshot injuries on them, which was decidedly strange. Lilac could only think that some unscrupulous poacher had recently killed the poor little mites, with the full intention of eating them. He was leaving them on the branch to retrieve later, while wantonly continuing with his illegal poaching. How strange, Lilac thought, studying the dead rabbits closely. She was wondering how a man could possibly be fast enough to catch up to a rabbit and then strangle it, as that didn't make any sense at all, unless the man himself owned a dog that caught the rabbits on his behalf, and then he strangled them. But by all accounts, when she looked closer, she could see there were no teeth marks on the rabbits from a dog's incisors. So how had these rabbits been killed? So much like a domestic chicken would be, with their necks twisted, hanging limp from their bodies. She took it upon herself to touch one of them. It was still warm, as she had suspected it would be. These rabbits were as fresh as the day was new. She could hardly believe it. She was meditating on the peculiarity of this rather bizarre situation, when out of nowhere a small stone went flying towards her, followed by another, and another. It gave her quite the start. She was being liberally showered with a ubiquitous spray of stones, almost as if someone wanted her to get the hell away from their dead rabbits. Lilac called out, "I'm not going to take your rabbits if that's what you're worried about. I'm going now." And as she spoke, everything calmed, and the stormy, indignant outburst of showery stones suddenly stopped. "What the hell?" she thought. "Some deranged poacher in the woods.
Who's killed the rabbits is afraid that I'm going to take them for myself. Steal his quarry, so to speak. I'd never do that. All the meat I eat, I purchase from Mr. Medcoff in town. And rabbit is never on my menu. Lilac thought to herself, although she had been told by Mr. Medcoff that rabbit tastes exactly like chicken. I know because my grandfather grew up in the countryside in England during the Second World War. They used to regularly kill rabbits to eat, because they were on food stamps and there was a lot of rationing, so they didn't get a lot of meat every week. He told me that the rabbits tasted exactly like chicken. Buddy was barking excitedly, as if he could see something that Lilac's eyes had failed to observe. What was he barking at, she wondered curiously. He seemed unusually excited, very invigorated, and was wildly thrashing his tail, like he did when he met locals or friends on the street, all who had a soft spot for the lovable retriever. Buddy's dark eyes were fixed on some burgeoning shrubbery, and he continued to bark and bark and bark. Lilac suddenly remembered, at one time a few years back, a vagrant had been seen living in the woods here. Everyone in town knew all about him. He had been called Mad Mike. Some folks thought he was slightly unhinged and not in his right mind. He'd often be seen sitting outside the butcher's with a cap in hand, begging for money. The rumour was he lost everything he'd owned after his wife died, so that his life fell apart, and then he turned to drink for solace. As a consequence, he lost his job and his home, and ended up completely homeless. Lilac had seen him once when walking her dog Buddy. He had grinned at her, with a gormless but wide gummy smile. Many of his teeth were missing on the front row, and the smile had made him look like a real simpleton. The man had dressed like a dishevelled scarecrow, wearing pants that were several inches too short for him, and an old, heavily patched tweed blazer that had almost certainly seen better days. In Lilac's humble opinion, he had always looked as if he'd been lying in a bed of leaves. His hair was always tangled up with leafy debris. One of the locals in town had accidentally stumbled across his camping site quite by chance when taking the wrong turning in the woodgrove. They'd seen his washing drying close to a creek, spread out across several branches. They'd observed a fire pit and a pile of bones from the animals he'd killed with a slingshot. Mad Mike was considered completely harmless, but not quite right in the head. People left him well alone, many feeling rather sorry for the poor man. But then one day no one saw Mad Mike again. People automatically assumed he'd moved away. Lilac privately wondered if Mad Mike was still very much around and had become increasingly more feral over the years, which would explain why he'd thrown the stones at her, so that she wouldn't go anywhere near his rabbits. I mean, you heard of human beings like that, didn't you? Lilac shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly, urging Buddy along down the footpath ahead of her, but she could not shake the foreboding feeling that she was being clandestinely watched. She wondered if Mad Mike was furtively hiding in the shadows, gormlessly watching her like a half-crazed maniac. The thought made her cringe. He must be back, she thought to herself, or maybe he never left in the first place. It certainly explained the appearance of the dead rabbits. Maybe the man had become a nifty hunter. She half expected to stumble across a couple of empty bottles of rum lying among the trees, but saw no signs of obvious litter to suggest Mad Mike was still around. And he had had a reputation for drinking an excess of rum, which was his go-to alcoholic beverage. Lilac and Buddy had really enjoyed their walk together, but now it was time to return back to the house. So when Lilac and Buddy retreated on their steps, going back the initial way that they had come, Lilac noticed that the rabbits that were hanging on the branch of the tree had all but vanished. Mad Mike must have taken them away, she thought. He was obviously incredibly protective over his food. As Lilac walked through the grove, the back of her neck began to burn. The feeling as if someone's eyes were drilling into the back of her skull was very apparent to her. She was certain she was being watched. She knew it with every fibre of her being. For a brief second, she turned around, and then she saw him. But it happened so fast, she thought she must be imagining it. She had to be, She wasn't used to getting up this early. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But in that poignant moment, time stood still, standing there larger than life, next to a tall, lofty pine tree. She had seen a shadowy figure with a pyramid-shaped head, ponderous shoulders, overlong arms, and with dark eyes that were staring at her. It was a Bigfoot. She could hardly believe it. In one hand the Bigfoot was holding a couple of rabbits. He lifted up the rabbits to show Lilac, as if to say, "These are mine. Don't think for a moment you can help yourself to my food. Don't get any ideas." At that the Bigfoot turned around and promptly glided back into the woods. Lilac rubbed her eyes, thinking, "Did I really see that?" By the end of the day, she had convinced herself it had all but been a trick of the light. Petty Waincroft, Petty, whose real name was Susan Nettles, began awkwardly pacing up and down the passageway of Wispy Wind Cottage that she had bought on a whim, against the professional advice of the Witness Protection Program. The seasoned professionals on the program thought she might be drawing attention to herself, moving to a small town where nobody knew who she was. It was better to merge into a busy cosmopolitan city where strangers were so commonplace so that no one would give you a fleeting or even passing thought. And in such a place, with a high populace, it was common not even to know your neighbours. Susan fancied living in the countryside, far away from it all, as for far too long she had felt like a bird cooped up in a gilded cage, with clipped wings that prevented her from flying. She had shunned the obvious claustrophobia she was feeling in her safely guarded life. At the time it had seemed like a bright idea to buy Wispy Wind Cottage on the spur of the moment. She had fallen hard for the place, once she had viewed it online, for it had tickled her wistful fancies, as she'd always rather liked the idea of living in a small town in the countryside. Now she wasn't exactly sure that moving here had been a sensible idea after all. Perhaps she should have listened more attentively to her advisers. People here in the small town were naturally curious about her, and had not been adverse to asking her awkward questions, especially that annoying, impertinent woman next door, who called herself Lilac Evans, who seemed to take great delight in virtually interrogating her. Susan had wantonly rebelled against the stringent rules of the Witness Protection Program, and at the end of the day it was her life, and no one could really take her freedom away from her against her will. They had agreed with her on this one, it was true, but they had warned her that some of her choices might be her greatest undoing, and if she ended up lying dead in a ditch, it would be on her head. They could give her the best advice for her own good, but if she chose not to listen to it, then it was her call. For the last 5 years, she had been living a very sheltered existence. It would seem she had testified in court against Dirk Underwood and against the most heavyweight thugs in a notoriously cutthroat drug cartel. She knew from thenceforth she'd never be entirely free again, especially while the ringleader Dirk Underwood was still around, still calling the shots from behind his prison cell. She knew that there would always be a price on her head, while that nauseating, insufferable man languished away in prison like an odious, bad, rotting stench that would never ever abate. How did I manage to pretend to be his girlfriend, she wondered. How did I even pull that stunt off? Because she could never do that again. She was grateful to have been legitimately given a brand new identity, and to be living under a new name, a name she'd chosen for herself, that once again she thought drew attention to herself. She should have stuck for something a little bit more simple, perhaps. She had been able to have plastic surgery to change her appearance, but was it enough? She wasn't exactly sure that it was. Would she ever feel safe again in her own skin? She was constantly nervously looking over her shoulders, expecting to see a dark hooded stranger creeping behind her, ready to pounce on her unawares. It was rather ironic that even if she looked different on the outside, on the inside she felt exactly the same, and that was part of the problem. Despite the fact that everything about her was strikingly different, she had lost a whole lot of weight, she was no longer blonde, and all her sunbathing had eliminated her former fair complexion.
But the neighbour was absolutely right. If she wasn't careful, she might end up getting skin cancer. So sunbathing all day on her deck was probably complete folly. She hated Dirk Underwood with a burning passion, for he had been the man that had brutally killed her brother Simon. And for what? Her brother had failed to get payment for a large supply of drugs, and that had been that. Why had her brother got embroiled with such evil, malicious men? Of course she knew the answer to that question painfully well. Simon would probably have sold his soul to the devil to support his drug habit. So the Cattell had used him just the way they wanted. She had seen her beloved brother wretchedly consumed by his drug addiction. He had become like a shadow of his former self, the brother she had known and loved throughout her entire childhood, fading before her eyes, like invisible ink disappearing on a white page. There were moments when Simon had said to her, "What the hell is happening to me? Look what a lowlife I've become. Oh, this is not me. This is not me, Susan. But it's like the drugs. They've taken me over. It's like a demon inside of me that has to be exorcised. But I don't know how to get rid of it. I wish I could get rid of it. I wish I didn't have to work for these evil men, Susan. You have no idea what they're capable of. You have no idea what they're like. But I've got myself between a rock and a hard place, and there's nothing I can do about this." Simon had had a bright future ahead of him, an opportunity to reach for the stars, for he had been an extraordinary songwriter with the potential to go very far. But this desire to write songs dissipated under the addiction, and his creative genius had been eaten alive by the drugs. Dirk Underwood had made an example of Simon by slicing off his head with a machete when he failed to deliver on his promises, and his head had been found in a bag in somebody's dumpster. It was a message for Mark Underwood to all those under his charge. "Don't mess with me, or this will happen to you," which meant everybody was afraid of the man. Susan had gone out of a limb to seduce the unsuspecting Dirk Underwood, and he had fallen hard for her charms, not knowing that she was the sister of one of the men he had deliberately slain. The rest was history, of course, as Susan had spilled the beans on the cartel, testified against the ringleader. She had gone all the way to do this on behalf of her late brother, to put the evil man responsible for his death behind bars, by secretly recording some of his conversations with her about what he'd done. But even though he was now in prison, he had his minions outside the prison walls doing his bidding, and he wanted Susan and her family dead, so they'd all gone into hiding in fear for their lives. Susan had seduced the unsuspecting Dirk Underwood. He had fallen hard for her charms, not knowing that she was the sister of one of the men he had deliberately slain. The rest was, of course, history. Susan had naturally spilled the beans on the cartel, testifying against Dirk Underwood. She had gone out of a limb for her late brother, to put the man responsible for his death behind bars for good, by secretly recording some of her conversations with him about what he'd done to her brother. But even though he was now in prison, he had his minions outside prison walls doing his bidding, and he wanted Susan Nettles and her entire family dead, so they'd all gone into hiding in fear for their lives under the witness protection program. More recently, after what you might describe as a 5-year leave of absence, Susan had rather recklessly started communicating with her long-lost boyfriend Ryan, after he thought she had disappeared off the face of the earth, when she'd slipped out of his life, rather like the melted butter sliding down a corn cob. She had been told by the witness protection program to sever all ties with her previous contacts, as reconnecting with them could be potentially very dangerous for her. But Susan had been unable to resist the allure of contacting her lost love, and wanting nothing more than to rekindle the relationship, which in hindsight had been a rather foolish thing to do, that she was beginning to regret. She had met up with Ryan at a secret rendezvous on several occasions, until Ryan realized that he had been stalked by a member of the drug cartel, who was under Dirk Underwood's influences. They had obviously learned that Ryan might have been in touch with his ex-girlfriend again,
so the man had been carefully watched. Susan knew that they would stop at nothing to find her, for they wanted revenge, to make her pay for what she had done by betraying Dirk Underwood and his duplicitous schemes to the authorities and testifying against him in court. She was the quintessential reason the big movers and shakers in that drug cartel were now behind bars. She was the one responsible for putting them there, and with good reason. But now, even 5 years on, her life was still on the line. Susan had gained great pleasure listening to the hell and damnation preaching that she had found on the radio. She liked the preacher's sermons and would get satisfying images of Dirk Underwood and his wicked minions suffocating in that lake of fire. Thoughts like that made her hope that hell was a real place, for she would certainly like to throw those evil men in the lake, for they had been responsible for so many disappearances, horrifyingly brutal murders and atrocities. In order to feel safe living her daily life, she had been given a sizable amount of money, so that she could lead an independent life without having to necessarily work if she chose not to. She had been advised that moving to a small town, in the very state where some of the cartel were now imprisoned, might indeed draw attention to her, the unwanted kind of attention. But she had been tired of listening to all the well-meaning advice that had left her feeling like a wild mare tethered to its stall. She had wanted to break free, which might come at a cost that she was unwilling to really pay. It was too late to look back on the path she had now chosen to take, with scattered regrets, defeated hopes, and restless nights. She couldn't backtrack now. She wanted to live this life independently from now on, and even if she was in mortal danger, she had thought it well worth the risk. But now she was not so sure. Was her bravery rather like a prickly pear in her hand, and now she wasn't liking the way her hand was beginning to feel. She certainly felt frustrated after Ryan had fortuitously paid her a visit at Wispy Wind Cottage. She knew giving him her address had been a foolish thing to do, especially after they had gleaned that some of the dark underbelly of Dirk Underwood's associates had been keeping close tabs on him, in the hope that Ryan himself might lead them directly to her, after having got wind of Ryan having got back together with a former girlfriend, which many suspected was Susan Nettles herself. "I do love you, Ryan, but we can't see each other any more," Susan had informed him. "We just can't. It's far too dangerous, and I care about you too much to pursue this relationship." Ryan had agreed to cut ties with the love of his life, but now, like a lamb to the slaughter, he had fortuitously chosen to visit her at her new address when she'd specially told him not to. Susan could not shake off the gut-wrenching, bodeful feeling that he had unwillingly, despite his very best efforts to be scrupulously careful, brought danger to her front door. Ryan was insistent that no one had followed him to her cottage that day. But how? How could he be sure about that? These notoriously evil scoundrels had friends in high places. They were cunningly clever, resourceful, manipulative, and Susan had a sense that she was now living on borrowed time. So there we are, that's the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.